I'm drawing a tower in one of the streets of Bern in Switzerland. A magnificent, I'm not sure whether it's technically a late medieval or an early Renaissance town, but with gloriously preserved architecture, there really is so much to see and draw here. So this took me 25 minutes in real time to draw, and you're seeing it double time. So when I'm faced with doing a gestural drawing, in my mind, it's usually preparation for doing location sketching at some later stage. And the first thing to consider is what size pen am I going to use? Because with location sketching, with quick gestural drawing, I'm only going to use the one pen. I'm not going to be changing to different thicknesses. What sort of scale am I drawing? How large is my drawing going to be? What size is it going to be? How much detail do I want it to have? Are there any elements of the drawing where heavy lines are going to be important for visual impact and so forth? I decide to use a 0.5 because I figure that will give me the most flexibility. I'm not going to be drawing too much detail because it's going to be such, for me anyway, relatively quick drawing. But I do want to be able to make some lines quite heavy, particularly these overhead tramway, a cable car, whichever lines that crisscross the street, because I feel that's fairly important. The other question to think about is the best place to start. And I think in this scene, it's fairly straightforward to start with the center of this tower because it's in the center and therefore I can radiate out from it and get a sense of proportion and distance as I go. I make the tower a little bit too narrow or a little bit too high, whichever way you want to look at it. But it is a quick gestural drawing, so I'm not going to agonize that. In fact, I didn't realize that really it was too narrow until after I'd finished because I was so busy moving on to the next thing, which is a great way to keep our lines gestural. We don't want to start off briskly, but then start to slow down and get bogged down in detail because we want to have a unified line work and a unified sense of detail and speed throughout the whole drawing. We don't want one part to look like it actually belongs to a different drawing. The other thing to consider is what is the impact I want to get from the scene? What's the overall feeling that I'm trying to capture? When someone glances at my drawing, what do I want them to see of this scene in front of me or in my reference that I really like? And I think for me, for this scene, I wanted to capture the sense of framing from the buildings on each side. I wanted to capture the sense of the overhanging rooftops that we had, giving this wonderful sense of enclosure of this fairly narrow street, and also the sense of enclosure from all of the wires that crisscross for various reasons quite low down. It really adds to the feeling of small scale for a modern city street. Now I'm using horizontal lines here to indicate both the lines of tiles on the roofs, but also in a way doubling up as hatching to indicate local colour. Although this is a very fast drawing, we're not wanting it to be too loose or too careless. There are some things that, particularly in an architectural scene, we need to make sure we get right. And in this scene, the key thing that I think had to be reasonably correct to work were the perspective angles of the rows of windows on each side of the street. And that's because they, in effect, point towards the tower at the end of the street. They're almost like arrows surrounding the subject of the scene. But I need the arrows to all line up the way they should. The perspective in this scene is the sort of thing where if it works, we really don't notice it. But if it doesn't work, if some of the lines are angled wrong, then it starts to look strange and starts to bring visual confusion into the scene and creates a pull away from the central point that they're meant to be pointing at. So now I put the top of this tower on. I was working very hard to centre this spire over the roofing I'd done below, and I didn't actually notice until pretty much the very end of the drawing that I really placed the lower part of the roof, this wonderfully kind of shaped, wonderfully narrowing pyramid kind of structure, too far to the right. So what I realized now what I did was when I was placing the central point to line up, I didn't allow for the fact that it went further than what I'd drawn on the left-hand side, which in effect shifted it to the right slightly. So there's a take-home for next time. And this is why it's always useful to have a good look at our drawings after we finished and to critique them and get a sense of what can I learn for next time? What's something that I perhaps didn't observe carefully enough that I need to observe more carefully next time? So I'm being very simplified with the details at ground level because I find that ground level is often the most challenging part of a scene to draw. Firstly, because there's usually more detail there than anywhere else. I mean, there's the buildings behind. The ground level story of many buildings often is more complex. There's not just a couple of relatively straightforward windows, but there's often a display or there's fancier entranceways. Are often reflections on glass, and there are often people coming in and out. Now, on top of that, you've possibly got cars that are obscuring parts of the ground level, obscuring where the building actually connects with the ground. You've got lights, lampposts, signage. You've got often garbage cans in the street. You might have motorcycles and things parked in front in a haphazard or even in an organised way that all create a lot of visual information, not just to have to draw, but to have to align up with each other. Now, in a very fast gestural drawing, it's going to be easy to either get bogged down and start to go too slow and fall into that trap I mentioned before, of shifting our sense of line work and not drawing this with the same or in a unified way with the rest of the drawing. Or we draw it more quickly and can't reference things off each other accurately enough and just ends up being out of scale and looking careless and distracting in a bad way. So I kind of left the things at this point, and as I went on, I actually didn't feel the need to put in much more at ground level in this spot. I put some people in, which I think is important because that anchors the scene, but it also shows where the ground level actually is, because the people's feet, except for the very closest figure, who only appears from the knees up, because their feet touch the ground. So it does give a strong sense of the ground receding backwards, but it did avoid all this clutter at ground level that I think would have obscured the sense of the base of the tower and the road going through the tunnel underneath. I could have done some of the things on the other side of the tunnel, but while we could see those things, I thought it just worked nicer to leave it clear so that it was a very strong visual shape and point of attention in a secondary sense, I suppose, to the circle of the clock. And so I'm working on these buildings on the left-hand side. The windows here were quite different. It would have been easy just to have drawn them more similar to those on the other side, but I decided to have a go at capturing something of what was there. This is the side where it's more difficult for me, being right-handed, to get those perspective angles and to space the windows across, because I feel like I'm pushing against the natural flow of how I should be drawing. And so it's important with these very top perspective angles that I don't flatten them out too much. They're really quite extreme angles. It feels like I'm almost drawing vertical lines towards the tops of these buildings. And this is where we have to grit our teeth and say, I've got to draw what I see and not what I feel like it has to be. This is where careful observation comes in, because if we don't observe super accurately and then really work hard to draw that angle, then we're going to end up in trouble. And with angles flattened, that end up just not looking as dramatic, because these very top lines of the buildings are my strongest lines that lead the eye down to the tower. They're a fairly key part of the framing. But by now I am fairly warmed up in a nice loose style of line work. You'll notice I'm not really measuring the angles with my pen, because in a gestural drawing I might measure 1 or 2 angles, but in a gestural drawing it's really faster than that, and I really have to go just by eye. And now some of these thick lines, which I think are 2 lines each of my 0.5 millimeter pen. Notice that I draw the overhead light first, and then I draw the wires going from the center away. That means it's nice and accurate, and they meet right above the light. And now I do some of these tramway, trolley, bus, whatever we like to call it, wires in the street. I probably could have done a few more there, but I was starting to be a bit distracted by how much time I'd taken. I'd really hoped to have been finished by now, so just doing these last parts. So I decided that I'm going to do light hatching over these buildings in the distance, just to try and create a bit of separation between the buildings on each side, the tower, and the buildings on the left. I think I could have done that a bit more seriously. I certainly would have used a much lighter pen if I was going to be using multiple fine liners, but making it go darker was the best I could think of at this point. And then, as you can see, I'm simplifying the ground level. I'm not really drawing ground level on each side, but I am doing some of the details that come down to ground level so that we get a sense of where it is, but it's not so strong that it's going to draw the eye. And I've noticed that this tower doesn't sit quite straight, so I was just trying to make a few tiny adjustments. While I was doing the voiceover, I realized there was just one part that I really wanted to put in that I did leave out, and that was this section here. I decided, well, because I wasn't drawing that building, I'd leave it out. But of course, it's one of the lines that leads to our central subject, so it is, I think, important to put in. And this then just slightly increases our sense of framing, of angling down in towards our central area. I'll let you decide whether it was worth doing or not, or whether it was better off without it. G'day, I'm Stephen Travis, and if you want to have a go drawing this scene yourself, either in a quick 20-minute gestural drawing or in a longer session if you want, then you'll find this photo on my channel community page. But whatever you draw and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.